and democratic politics, and the perils of federalism, race, poverty, and the politics of crime control. And she will present today a new paper she has published very recently, the title of which is American Exceptionalism or Exceptionalism of the Americas, the Politics of Lethal Violence, Punishment, and Inequality. We thought that this was a very interesting paper in order to start this workshop series, because in some way it's trying to bridge global north, global south. So thank you very much, Lisa, for accepting to do this first presentation. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Maximo and Richard, for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here, and it's a pleasure to see so many familiar names and faces. I wish I could say hello to all of you, but I see you, and it's wonderful. And thank you all for being here. I hope I can kick us off with if nothing else, a provocative set of claims. So I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Can you see this? Yes, okay. So let me just, okay. Oh, good, okay. So are you seeing just my screen, or are you also seeing my notes? Just the screen? Everything's good, it's all good, okay. Okay. All right, well, thank you. As Maximo said, this is from a wonderful volume put together by these fabulous folks. You can see at the bottom of the slide. And it was a great pleasure to develop this paper. It is a new project. It's very early stages of a project, even though I've been thinking about it for some time. But it is something that I am pursuing in a larger for a larger book project. So let me just start by sharing what is probably well known and obvious to most of you, which is the outlier status of the U.S. in relation to other what we call rich democracies. Obviously, I've just picked a sample of them here, but you could take just about any OECD country, any of the sort of 23 long-standing OECD countries, and put them on this chart, and none of them would be close to the United States, obviously in imprisonment or in homicide. And for those of you who know my work, that's one thing that I've spent a lot of time on, is trying to understand the politics of lethal violence. And the United States is not only an outlier in imprisonment, but also in violence. And one of the problems that has created for me as a scholar is sort of, the endogeneity problem of sorting out the relationship between violence and punishment in contexts where they're both very low or they're both very high. So my own work has kind of gone from this very micro level study I did in graduate school to thinking about the US, to thinking comparatively with Europe. And now I'm on to thinking about continents. So I don't know where that's going to lead me next, but this puzzle really has really stuck with me. And as a matter of fact, shout out to Vanessa Barker, who asked me with the myth of mob rule what my theory of lethal violence is, and I didn't have one. And it really got me thinking, why do some countries offer so much more security from what I call state and street violence than others? And these are just sort of, shorthand terms. Street violence being, the sort of violence between citizens, and state violence being everything from imprisonment to executions to police killings and so on. And it's a question, obviously, many of us are interested in, but by linking sort of the crime, the street crime side of it with the state side of it, this has been a real puzzle for me, and I've been really fascinated by how these things interact and why there's such variation, across countries and across regions and across continents. So alongside of this puzzle, I sort of stumbled across the fact that the Americas have an extraordinarily high number of homicides relative to the rest of the world, roughly a third, despite the fact that only about 12% of the global population lives in the Americas. So that was intriguing to me. And it turns out, and I'll show you in a minute, the US looks in many respects more like the Americas than it does like Europe. More like the Americas than the countries that it fits in with in terms of GDP and human development and all those things. And it looks like that on violence and imprisonment, but also on a lot of other things. The nature of its political institutions, its colonial history, racial heterogeneity. So this was sort of the inspiration for this new project, in thinking about if there's something distinctive that we can puzzle through with respect to the nature of state building and state development in the Americas relative to Europe and the former British Commonwealth, that can help us understand and explain high levels of violence of many kinds relative to in the Americas relative to elsewhere. So the question really that sort of animates this is, why do some countries have homicide rates that are, virtually zero, and others extraordinarily high? And then why are some states more willing to imprison and kill their citizens than others? Now, these are questions, obviously, I'm not the first to ask these questions. I mean, this animates so much of what we do, but I'm thinking about it not only together, sort of how these things interact, but also in a larger sense of state building. So stepping back from some of the micro processes or short-term trends that might shape these outcomes, which certainly are very real and very important, but thinking more about at the level of nation states and the level of the kinds of institutional and cultural factors that might lead to these very distinctive outcomes. So the project has a sort of big conceptual framing, and I'm very curious. I'm very interested in reactions to this. I've become very focused on what I call security from violence as sort of first order political, as a first order political problem. So minimizing street violence is foundational to state building, sort of Hobbesian view that the first job of the state is to keep us from killing each other. And I mean, that's a very crude way of putting it, but I think it's clear that a lot of state development early on revolves around the monopoly of violence on the part of the state in order to proceed with a whole variety of other forms of state building. And then minimizing state violence is obviously central to our modern conceptions of democracy. We don't imagine modern democracies to be functioning well when they're excessively punitive or when they're killing their own citizens through policing or executions and so on. So by sort of thinking about these things together, thinking about them sort of conceptually as both forms of violence, both of which are reducing them is central to state building. This draws in a whole lot of different kinds of a whole lot of different factors that we often talk about with relation to imprisonment. But I think it also implicates political institutions and heterogeneity in ways that we perhaps haven't thought about quite as much. So rather than think about the United States and sort of trying to understand why the United States is such an outlier in relation to Europe, I've become interested in situating the United States in the larger unique history and development of the Americas. And I'm just going to show you a slide comparing imprisonment, homicide, and this political terror scale, which is a sort of scale of state violence. And there's a lot here, but I just want to call your attention to a few things. Obviously, the very dramatic differences between Latin America and Europe, and this includes Mexico. This is everybody except the US and Canada. Canada, by the way, is a very interesting case. And I'm not going to talk a lot about Canada, but I'm happy to talk about Canada in questions and later. So there's clearly some very, very big differences between Europe and Latin America on imprisonment and homicide and the terror scale, and the United States is an interesting doesn't fit neatly into either. On political terror, it certainly looks very similar to Latin America, which might surprise some Americans, or perhaps not. On homicide, it's clearly an outlier, a low outlier in the Americas and a high outlier in Europe, but it is within one standard deviation of the in Latin America, which is interesting. There's a lot of variety in Latin America in terms of rates of homicide. And the United States is not the lowest. Chile traditionally, historically, and today has lower homicide rates than the United States. And Argentina has roughly on par with the U.S. So it's an outlier, but not an extreme outlier. There are other countries that also have lower rates, but it also is within a standard deviation, which I think situates it better in Latin America than in Europe, and it's not even close to the average homicide rate in Europe. Imprisonment, obviously, also the U.S. is again an outlier, and not within the standard deviation. It's a really extreme outlier, although even more so compared to the average in Europe. I'll talk a little bit about why I think that is. I think part of the state building story is just capacity. The United States has enormous capacity and a lot of wealth, and if we think about sort of that aspect of the United States, it's not perhaps as surprising that we have our imprisonment rates are significantly higher, but we'll come to that. So this is kind of the early framework for thinking about why situate the United States in the Americas. And I'm certainly interested in if you think it's a mistake to extricate the United States from comparisons with Europe and think about the Americas instead. But I hope I've made a case in the chapter for why I think that's a good move. So what is the story here, right? How do we understand? If you buy my argument that the Americas is something distinctive, and we should study them in thinking about violence, we should study them sort of as having some shared past. Well, and this is where things get very interesting, and I've become very enamored with some of the big theories of lethal violence coming out, for example, of Donald Black's idea of violent self-help, that violence is really a way of solving conflict that not only that isn't just about the immediate interaction between two individuals, but that's about the larger social trust and political legitimacy that inheres in any given society, and that the lower the social trust and the lower the sense of political legitimacy, the more likely people are to act out conflict resolution in violent ways. I've also been very intrigued with this argument that Randolph Roth has put forward in his book American Homicide about the failure of nation building in the United States relative to rates of violence. And it's a fascinating argument. I mean, it's for a lot of people from the US, it sounds strange to say we failed at nation building, but Roth's point is that one of the key successes of nation building elsewhere was to reduce people's motivations and desires and impulse to act out conflict or resolve conflict in a violent manner. And he makes what I think is a pretty compelling case for contexts in the 19th century where the franchise was broadly extended, where there was sort of central state consolidation that legitimated the state in a way that people were more willing to accept resolution to conflict through other means. And the United States did not accomplish this same kind of nation building. The Civil War could have been that moment, but as probably many of you know, though I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A, we're still fighting the Civil War in the United States. We're still struggling to consolidate and centralize fundamental features of a democratic society, like the right to vote, the right to participate, the right to be a part of deciding what government will do. So to me, it's been a very intriguing story. And I think about these things in relation to Roth and Donald Black. And there are, of course, lots of others too. Gary Lafree and even David Garland has made some of these arguments that for our purposes in thinking about violence, what nation building does is create a sense of vertical and horizontal trust and legitimacy. And I don't want to overstate this. I don't think Roth means that it's all, it's not Pollyannish, but the idea that people consider themselves better off within the state than without it, that they're willing to acquiesce to state power and state resolution of conflict, requires a sense of social trust and legitimacy that that can, for the most part, leave people with a feeling of satisfaction. So I like this particular quote from Roth's book. What he means by vertical and horizontal trust and legitimacy is comity among elites, strong institutions, you know, inspired leadership. And this last bit is extremely important for our purposes in thinking about the Americas. You know, you can have differences across religion, class, race, ethnicity, and Roth's not claiming that nation building, effective nation building eliminates them. But what it does reduce is people's kind of existential feeling that these conflicts are irresolvable, and that at least the recognition that we're going to tolerate each other can create a context in which people are less willing to use violence to solve conflict. So the sort of upshot of all this is that where nation building is weak or incomplete, trust between fellow citizens languishes, and political and social hierarchies become besides flourish. So, gosh, time flies when you're. So I don't want to take. I want to leave lots of time for discuss questions and so on. So let me just give you a brief overview of what I'm thinking about here in terms of the emergence of state building in the Americas. And I'm flattening enormous variation, which I totally recognize. But I'm just at this point trying to articulate a kind of conceptual framework for understanding lethal violence in the Americas and street violence in the Americas. And I'm recognizing that there's enormous variation here, but virtually all of the Americas comes out of this context of slave and settler colonialism. And there's a lot of really interesting literature on this, that these contexts created incentives for elites to avoid creating political institutions that might require power sharing with these larger populations. And the result was, you know, a lot of sort of piecemeal and very fragmented political institutions that divide power across elite groups and facilitate the exclusion and disenfranchisement of lower castes and other racial categories. It also, it turns out, can make it very difficult to get things done. It can make it difficult for nation states to do the kind of state building that invests in people broadly, writ large, and generates a larger sense of trust and legitimacy that we see in countries with more consolidated central authority. So this history of settler and slave colonialism, I'm suggesting, reduced the ability of nation states to state build, or I should say, created incentives for dominant racial groups to generate institutions that would maintain a firewall, if you will, between sort of the elites and the masses. And Miguel Centeno has this great claim here about Mexico, which I think captures in many ways a lot of what my thinking is, and we can apply this to the United States as well. That there was this sort of always better to be to collaborate and consolidate with the dominant elites, even if it meant you know, sort of preserving colonial power, than to push power down to the classes that were enslaved or indentured or otherwise regarded as subhuman and unworthy of participation. So yeah, we can see this in the U.S. So very briefly, this is I'm looking at institutions and race and inequality and the number of different of the sort of macro structures that I care about. And this system categories here is just parliamentary or presidential, parliamentary or strong presidential. Interestingly, you know, the Americas are largely presidential, and Europe is not. The Americas have many more bicameral systems, as the United States does, rigid constitutions that are hard to amend, deep malapportionment in upper chambers where there is bicameralism, and the racial heterogeneity is just incomparable between the Americas and Europe. And the U.S. falls sort of somewhere between Europe and Latin America on inequality. So maybe just a couple more minutes, Richard and Maximo, does that sound good? Okay. So in the second part of the paper, I sort of I talk about this in the context of the US. And obviously, there are many different circumstances and realities in the United States that differ from Latin America. And of course, these things differ across Latin America. But I'm just trying to illustrate what I mean by the sort of fractured nation building that makes it hard to consolidate central authority in ways that increase trust and legitimacy. And so in the United States, there's been this persistent manipulation and utilization of fragmented institutions to block power sharing with, at first, African Americans, but over time, lots of other non-whites. So there's this sort of white nativist strain of politics in the United States that exercises disproportionate influence relative to their numbers, which I don't mean to suggest they're a tiny portion of the population, but they're not the majority. But they sort of routinely utilize these very fragmented institutions like federalism. Actually, I think I listed them. They pretty much used them all. Name an institution of the American constitutional system. And it's been very carefully crafted and utilized by opponents of power sharing. And this sort of persistent disruption and fracturing of access to power generates not only high levels of distrust between the obvious groups, whites and blacks, but within racial categories. This is one of Roth's, I think, really interesting insights, that state building doesn't just mean reducing conflict between groups that you might think of as sort of traditionally having conflict. Most violence happens between people of the same race. And that's, I think, a really important insight. So the sort of nature of our institutions have made it very difficult to create the kind of trust in and legitimacy about the state that Roth and others say can reduce the impulse to solve conflict in a violent manner. So let me actually, I have two questions I want to conclude with, but before that, let me just briefly show you, briefly link this to imprisonment. I think that one of the things that might be useful to think about is the relationship between state building and capacity. And if we look at, if we put those sort of things together, we can see that there's a pretty interesting relationship between state capacity, which I'm measuring here simply as GDP, and imprisonment rates. And so we wouldn't necessarily expect high rates of homicide to lead directly to high rates of imprisonment if the state has a low sort of capacity, both fiscally and sort of infrastructure wise. And there are some outliers here. We might look at Uruguay and Chile and say, you know, they have relatively low rates of homicide. These are the imprisonment rates in parentheses, but relatively high rates of imprisonment, but they also have a lot of capacity. And at the other end, we might see Honduras and Guatemala. These are states that have enormous homicide rates, but very relatively low imprisonment rates, but they're also very low GDP. So there's a lot to resolve here in terms of the sort of prevalence of violence and the use of state capacity for state violence for imprisonment. But these are some of the things that I'm thinking about. Let me just finish by asking a couple of questions. Which is, you know, is state building in the manner of the wealthy democracies that we see that have such low rates of violence and relatively low rates of street violence and low rates of state violence and imprisonment. You know, they're relatively homogeneous. I mean, one exception might be Britain, which is more diverse than a lot of Europe, certainly not more than the US, which is on the higher end of imprisonment, but very low rates of sort of lethal violence between citizens. So that's a troubling question, I think, and it raises the question of how to induce power sharing in these other contexts. If I'm onto something about fragmentation and nation building, and the relationship between those developments and the history of settler and slave colonialism, what kinds of mechanisms might we have for inducing and developing greater power sharing in ways that can genuinely draw the populace writ large into a sense of the nation in ways that might both reduce the resorting to violence between citizens and also the impulse and desire to imprison and use the state's force to kill its own citizens. So I've got plenty more to say, but I'll stop there because I'm very interested in your responses.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It was really, really interesting.